If you want to know how I made my corset cover, then please stick around. The early 1900s was characterized by a very particular shape in women's clothing. The hourglass figure, with a small waist, or at least the appearance of it, with wide hips and a larger chest. The pigeon-breasted look was also on the rise. Pigeon-breasted was the term used to describe women's clothing in profile. When it comes to the Edwardian silhouette, the chest was left in the natural position, as opposed to the more Victorian pushed up look. To achieve this silhouette, the top of some dresses and blouses were designed to hang very loose from the chest, but were cinched in at the waist. Corset covers can help to achieve the correct silhouette. A corset cover is a simple garment designed to disguise lines or ridges due to corsets beneath their clothing, and more specifically, the lace and frills became more puffy and full to help support the silhouette of the time. The corset cover, or bust bodice, supports the ideal monobosom of the turn-of-the-century silhouette. The actual support of the bust is very low, with no use of gussets beneath serving to separate them. Bust improvers were employed when a little extra padding was needed, but this is not to say that every woman wore one or even needed one. I recently watched Nicole Rudolph's video where she fell down that slippery slope of research on Edwardian bustle. You should definitely check that video out, it is very informative. But in short, she discovered that women in the 1890s used to dramatically pad out their shape to near ridiculous proportions, oftentimes becoming the butt, no pun intended, of many satirical illustrations of the time, poking fun at women's clothing. Not only did they receive lots of ridicule, but men were also not fooled by them. It wasn't until after 1900 that bustles and bust improvers and/or padding out one's shape was acceptable again, under the guise that it was acceptable to fill out one's shape if the purpose was to supply you with enough filling for you to achieve the popular shape of the time, but not to dramatically alter one's shape. So while being plus size has its advantages, it seems I don't have sufficient enough curves in all the right places. So of course it's perfectly acceptable for me to pad out my chest and hips to achieve that Edwardian silhouette, since my actual bosom is lacking. According to authentic Victorian dressmaking techniques, with the amount of necessary work to make nightdresses and petticoats inclines one towards the machine method, of which I am also inclined. No raw edges of the material are left at the seams in this class of work. Every seam is either French seamed or is felled. I went ahead and sewed the side and shoulder seams with French seams. With embroidery thread, I gathered the waist edge of the corset cover. I tied the tail of the gathering thread in a knot so it wouldn't pull free from the fabric. I did a quick fitting of the corset cover and wasn't happy with the amount of volume in the upper chest area. And unfortunately, I didn't get the fitting on camera. I realized the silhouette of the corset cover is supposed to be pigeon-breasted, but there was just too much fabric volume. I gathered down at the top edge of the corset cover to take up some of the extra volume. I turned my attention to the button placket. After sewing the placket facing, I then ironed the seam open, turned down the edge and ironed it flat, before securing it with a few pins. Then stitch the button placket. For the second fitting, I pulled the gathering threads to tighten the neck and waist to fit me. I was much happier with this fitting than I was with the first. Once I was happy with the adjusted gathers, I tied the gathering threads to keep them in place, then sewed the shoulder seams of the facing. Per truly Victorian's instructions, I pinned the neck facing onto the wrong side. Yes, the wrong side of the fabric, stopping as soon as I got to the gathering stitches. I double-checked the adjustment of the gathers and stitched the facing down entirely. I then ironed the edge of the facing upward by 1/4 inch. I took my time with this so that the finished product would be as neat as possible. After I clipped the curves of the facing, I turned it over to the right side of the fabric, pinning it into place. For the front of the corset cover, I pulled taut the upper and lower edge, flattening the gathers and evenly distributing them under the facing. Then I trimmed the excess a bit, folding it under itself. But I did not stitch down the facing at this time. I'm happy with how the corset cover is coming along, so I'm going to switch my focus over to making it even prettier. I sewed all 3 ruffle pieces together, then equally cut the rectangle into 4 pieces of equal size, then folded the width in half. I decided to use a white cotton crochet trim, so I needed to stay stitch the cut ends so that it didn't unravel. I folded the short ends of the rectangle inward by 1/4 inch to finish the edges, then top stitch the crocheted trim onto the folded edge of the ruffle. I used a zigzag stitch to overcast the raw edge of the ruffle. Then stitched a double row of gathering stitches along the top raw edge of the ruffle. Carefully, I unpinned the facing, pulling the gathers of the corset cover taut as I work the ruffle just under the edge of the facing. I adjust the gathers of the ruffle to fit across the length of the facing. I tucked under the raw edge to create a nice finish to the end of the ruffle. For the second ruffle, I decided to place it slightly under the top ruffle so that it slightly overlaps. With a running back stitch, I attach the second ruffle. Next, I pin bias strips of the same cotton muslin to the armholes. And I use the same running back stitch to attach the bias binding. I folded the raw edge of the bias binding, then folded it once more, pinning it into place, then slip stitched it. To finish off the bottom edge of the corset cover, I used the same bias binding to act as a waistband. I evenly finessed the gathers before pinning on the bias strips, sewing the binding as I did the armhole. I folded the raw edge of the binding, then folded it once more, pinning it down and slip stitching it into place. With my thread snips, I cut the basting threads, pulling them free. Next, I plan my buttonhole spacing. I space them according to the design of the corset cover, not necessarily placing them evenly according to the length of the placket, like one would normally do. I couldn't find anything to measure that was close at hand, so I commandeered the card the buttons came on to mark a consistent distance from the edge of the fabric. With a pencil, I lightly mark an even distance on the fabric. This will be the starting point on which I will machine embroider the buttonholes. I consulted authentic Victorian dressmaking techniques once more. With the amount of work necessary to make night dresses and petticoats inclines one towards the machine method, of which I am also inclined, so machine-bound buttonholes it is. I embroidered a total of 7. Pin both sides of the buttonhole just within the stitching. The The pins in the fabric won't allow the seam ripper to spontaneously splice through the fabric and ruin hours of hard work. I've heard there is something called a buttonhole punch, but I don't own such witchcraft. I pushed a button through the buttonhole to check the size, and it passed. Repeat this step for all the buttonholes. Once all the buttonholes are open, squeeze a few drops of freight check on them and let them dry. Overlapping the placket, I stick a pin through each buttonhole to determine my button placement. Where the tip of the pin is pierced into the fabric is where the buttons will be sewn onto the fabric. I decided to take a page out of a fellow costumer's book. Kat, from Kat's Costumery, found among her research a leaf design when sewing on the buttons. I thought this was such a sweet little detail that I had to recreate it on this corset cover. And here is the completed corset cover. If you feel like sticking around or just want to see what other adventures I get up to, please consider subscribing. And if you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. Thank you so much for stopping by my channel. I really appreciate you spending your time with me. Please stick around for when I post my petticoat video coming soon.